I also have another hat, namely being a member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This is my current UN home. This is one of the three mechanisms, indigenous-specific mechanisms at the United Nations system. But previously, I also served in another mechanism, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, which has a slightly different mandate, and we are going to talk about it a little bit more in detail later. So I will, during my presentation, I will touch upon some issues regarding decision-making bodies of indigenous peoples, like traditional authorities and traditional decision-making institutions, but also some more contemporary institutions that indigenous peoples have established around the Arctic. And we will talk about cross-border cooperation of indigenous peoples in the Arctic, including the Arctic Council and other regional intergovernmental organizations, and also global involvement of indigenous peoples of the Arctic, including the United Nations and other institutions. I should also mention that I am myself indigenous, half indigenous, representing the Karelian people. This is one of the indigenous peoples residing in the Russian northwest part, and therefore I will also bring some insights and examples from the Karelian indigenous movement as well. Okay, let me share my presentation. I think I have something like 26 slides, but I will try to make sure that we will have enough time to for questions and discussion. Okay. So the issue of indigenous peoples' participation broadly and having their own decision-making institutions is a very topical issue right now in the global context, because even in the United Nations General Assembly, there are broad discussions about indigenous peoples' participation in the United Nations system. But also, and probably most importantly, it is needed to speak about indigenous people's participation in a domestic level, in the local level, in all those levels that are most influential for the lives of indigenous peoples. And of course, in the first place, when we speak about indigenous participation, we speak about recognition, because in some places there are still situations when indigenous peoples are not recognized as indigenous peoples, and this is a problem for their ability to obtain not only individual rights but also collective rights that belong to indigenous peoples and that are recognized internationally and stipulated in international standards and treaties that we will speak about them in the future. So there is no opportunity for further development of indigenous peoples' decision-making institutions without recognition of indigenous peoples. And when indigenous peoples go to the United Nations, for example, to the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, advocating for their rights and seeking a permanent seat in the United Nations system, so sometimes they even have challenges of being recognized in the home countries where they live in. And this is, this is probably mostly the case in the countries like in the regions like the Asia region, for example, or Africa, some places in Latin America as well. But also in the Arctic sometimes, and we can see the examples. Sometimes indigenous peoples are or have problems with recognition. When we speak about participation and decision-making processes, we also speak about the indigenous people's rights to participate in the social life and decision-making processes of the states where they live in. So indigenous peoples do not only have the rights to have their own decision-making bodies and institutions, but also they have the right to participate equally with other peoples in decision-making in their home countries and in the regions, in the cities, in the municipalities they live in, which means their ability, the right to participate, for example, in the processes of modern democracy, like elections, and sometimes because indigenous peoples live in the remote areas, or they speak their own languages, or they have their own cultural traditions. So they, all these processes of modern democracy need to be friendly for these specificities that indigenous peoples have. For example, the ballots in the voting ballots of indigenous populating areas can be also printed in their indigenous native languages, or there can be special arrangements for indigenous peoples to be able to vote in elections. And in some cases, when we speak about the equal participation and citizenship, which is a right that is stipulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we can have some good examples of when establishing state indigenous councils or organizations that consist of indigenous and state representatives and that are devoted to the consultation processes, which is very important. One of the topical, also most topical issues right now when we speak about indigenous participation is the right to control of indigenous languages and education system, but also writing system when we speak about languages. And needless to say that indigenous peoples, and probably we should also here mention a term that is widely used in the United Nations discourse, and this term is free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC in short. So FPIC is a very important principle, or many experts say that this is a right to free, prior, and informed consent, and which means that in any issues that concern indigenous peoples or that could affect indigenous people's life, traditions, culture, languages, occupations, and so on, indigenous peoples must be consulted, or they must be included in consultations and decision-making processes in all stages, before, during, and after these decisions have been made. And this, of course, concerns, for example, the language policies or education system reforms and many other important issues. And why I'm speaking about languages so much is because we are now in a transition from the International Year of Indigenous Languages that concluded, that was in 2019, to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Both were proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly, and UNESCO was given a function of the Secretariat or a lead function in the process of preparation for the International Year and the International Decade. And of course, in the Arctic, the issue of languages, the disappearing languages and preservation of languages, the need for language development is a very important, not only because of the decade or the International Year, but also because it's such an important marker of indigenous people's self-identification and culture. And when we speak about the Arctic development, so there is the term, this term is widely used also in the United Nations context, sustainable development, which means that there should be economic development, but also the rights of the people in the Arctic should be ensured, and the economic development should not be undertaken at the expense of the rights of the Arctic populations. And of course, indigenous populations are the most are the people who have lived in the territory of the Arctic territory in this very severe climatic conditions, preserving the biological diversity for centuries, thousands of years, and that's why probably it should be an important, or it should be a priority for all Arctic states. And another, and now having expressed those most topical issues for where this decision making of indigenous people should be ensured. But of course, this list is not exhaustive, because of course all these rights are so much interconnected, interlinked, and when we speak about education, so then we cannot avoid the right to life, and when we speak about the right to development, it implies the right to health, for example, and so it's all interconnected, and as you probably know, human rights are indivisible, interconnected, and these main principles should be ensured when we speak about indigenous people's rights in the Arctic. When indigenous peoples approach their state counterparts and international organizations that they have to deal with, so they use their own traditionally established institutions that they have had for centuries, and also they establish institutions that are more contemporary, that reflect the democratic values and realities of the states, because they need to speak the same language, and they need to the language that the state could understand in order to advance their agenda. So there are some examples of those traditional authorities. For example, the Yukagir Council of Elders from the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in the upper picture. So the Yukagir is one of the small number of peoples of the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia and of the Russian Arctic as well. And this Council of Elders is a traditional authority that exists for centuries, and that allows for that elders could help in such daily issues as traditional occupation. So that was a tradition, but for now, the elders also are integrated in the decision making of the Yukagir people, so they can advise in the most important issues, and they can deal with the authorities on behalf of these people, because these are most respectful people and most respected people that are elected in the congresses of these people. Another traditional way of self-organization of indigenous peoples in the Russian Arctic is община, which is a community. Community is the smallest unit of self-organization of indigenous peoples that can be of two different types. One type is a community that is based on neighbors and family members, and another community type could be based on territorial neighborhood, so they could include some different families that live on the same territory. And these общиnas, so they are also in the Russian legal context, the общиnas are entities that are registered normally, and they could get benefits from the states local authorities and federal authorities some subsidies, benefits, fishing quotas, hunting quotas, and so on. And that's a very important way of making decisions as well. And when I mentioned the more contemporary bodies of decision making, so one of the most known examples probably is the Sami Parliament system in the Nordic countries. So we have Sami parliaments in Norway, in Sweden, and in Finland. We do not have a Sami Parliament in Russia, and there was an attempt to establish one, but it failed because of because of different points of view on this issue, or among some Sami leaders and the authorities, because the authorities believe that there should be just one parliament in the country, and indigenous peoples can only have councils or other types of institutions. And as a consensus, or as an alternative that emerged from the discussion, there was a Sami Sobar, which is a council of Sami people, which is a NGO that not NGO, but a decision-making body that is elected at a Congress of the Sami people. And of course, I visited last year in February the Sami Parliament in Norway, and we had a very interesting discussion with the president of the parliament, Ms. Alexey Tsykarev, who elaborated a little bit on why Samis in the Nordic countries do not have just one parliament, because this is one people, right? Sami people who just lives across the borders in 4 states, and why should they have 4 different decision-making institutions? And this is because of the pragmatic need for this. There is a pragmatic need to deal with 4 different states. And as Alexey Tsykarev said, that it is not them, it is not the Sami who created this situation. So they had lived on this territory before the nation states appeared, and the international borders were drawn, and that's why. So because now the Samis live in 4 countries, so they have to deal with each of these countries separately, and because of this pragmatic situation, so they need to establish 4 different decision-making bodies. And here, the lower picture is the Karelian Congress, which is also a more contemporary body where representatives are elected democratically from different municipalities, and they convene in a big meeting and select their governing body that implements the outcome document of the Congress in between the Congresses, and deals with the authorities and other counterparts on behalf of the Karelian people. But of course, some of the indigenous peoples living in the Arctic, so that they and the Samis are one example, but not the only example of cross-border indigenous peoples. We also have a couple of other organizations that, for example, Aleut International Association, that unites Aleuts living in different countries, like in Canada, in Russia, and then we have Inuit Circumpolar Council that unites Inuits from Alaska, United States, and Canada, and then Greenland and the Russian Chukotka, Chukchi people. And the Sami Council, right? So, which is an NGO that unites Samis in the 4 countries. And so it is important for indigenous peoples to self-organize themselves also internationally, because they need to deal with the international institutions like the Arctic Council, for example, which is the most important intergovernmental organization in the Arctic area, and the decisions that the Council makes have legal nature and binding nature for the member states of the Arctic Council, and that's why it was very wise decision that indigenous peoples would have a permanent participant seat in the Arctic Council. So six of these organizations that represent indigenous peoples, and these organizations are either organizations that represent one indigenous people living in several countries, or many indigenous peoples living in the same country, like the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Siberia, and the Far East, for example, RIPON. And these six organizations have permanent seats, they're permanent participants, and they sit on the same table with the states and discuss, and their position is taken into account while making decisions in the Council. And this example of indigenous participation is one of the most powerful examples globally, and this is recognized by the United Nations in many studies as a best practice. Another institution that is worth to mention is the Byrons Euro-Arctic Council, Byrons Cooperation, which is established by 7 countries, and this is and also indigenous peoples of the 4 countries, the Russian Federation, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, can participate in the Byrons Cooperation. And so the Byrons Cooperation have different structures, governance structures, like the Committee of Senior Officials or state representatives, then the regional cooperation, and different working groups and bodies. And indigenous peoples, they have their own working group on indigenous peoples, or working group of indigenous peoples, which is an independent group, and they can participate in all the bodies that are in the Arctic, in the Byrons Council, Byrons Cooperation, and provide their own opinion about these processes. And for the now, we have 3 indigenous peoples represented in the cooperation: the Sami, Veps people, and Nenets. And this, I mean, this is interesting because, as I said, for example, the Karelian people is also living in the in this area, right, in the Republic of Karelia, with having even access to the Barents Sea, and the Komi people in the Republic of Komi, which is also part of this this regional Barents cooperation. But these 2 indigenous peoples are somehow excluded from the Barents cooperation, and this is because these 2 peoples do not have an official status of small number of indigenous peoples in Russia. So only 47 peoples that are less than 50,000 people have this special status of small number of indigenous peoples. And this is mentioned in the constitution of the country, and somehow it impacts a lot the recognition situation, not only domestically, but also internationally when it comes to the participation in such bodies as the Barents Cooperation. But nonetheless, Arctic indigenous peoples are champions in the international affairs, including the United Nations system. For example, the Inuits and the Samis and the Russian Arctic indigenous peoples, they participate very actively in all the United Nations processes and different bodies. And they have, of course, led the processes of crafting the international human rights framework. All these documents that are important for indigenous peoples, like the convention, ILO Convention, Convention of the International Labour Organization number 169. Unfortunately, this is the only legally binding document concerning particularly indigenous people's rights. And unfortunately, it is not ratified by many Arctic states. Russia has not ratified it. Finland has not ratified it. Sweden, so Norway has ratified the convention, ILO Convention. United States hasn't either. So it's a constant process of advocating for the for better legislative improvement, and which includes ratification of internationally legally binding documents. But when we speak about the international human rights standards, one document is important in particular, and this is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was approved or voted for in the General Assembly in 2007. And this is not a legally binding document, but this is a document that led to a global consensus, because in 2014, all states, all member states of the United Nations agreed while they convened at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. So they agreed that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a minimum standard when it comes to Indigenous peoples' rights globally. And all states should be guided by the Declaration when they improve their legislation or practical measures to support Indigenous peoples. And there are three bodies at the United Nations that are important for the international participation. And these are the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the forum, the Permanent Forum is a subsidiary body of the ECOSOC, and therefore social and economic development is the main focus of this body. For example, the forum supervises how the Sustainable Development Goals are being implemented when it comes to Indigenous peoples' indicators. Then we also have 5 other topics mandated: culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. And there are 16 members sitting in for their own socio-cultural regions or states, because half of this membership is elected from amongst Indigenous peoples and half from among states. So that's why sometimes we have to really discuss and be guided by consensus. And currently, the forum is chaired by Anne Norgam, who is a Sami person from Finland, member of the Sami Parliament in Finland. So that's why I'm saying that Arctic indigenous peoples are very active globally, because actually both the Permanent Forum and indigenous and the expert mechanism are chaired by Sami people. And so here's the membership, and for us it's a very good opportunity for the forum to go to the countries. And so these pictures are from it was just before the pandemic started in February, so we had an opportunity to convene in the Finnish Lapland in Inari, and even our Chinese colleague arrived just before all the lockdowns and so on. And we went to the Norway side, discussed with the Sami parliaments, and we also met the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland, and we had a chance to advocate, also not only discuss global issues, but advocate for the rights of indigenous peoples in the Arctic. I will skip some slides because we are running out of time, and I would like to have a discussion with you. Just a couple of more things. One is very important because I already mentioned the transition from the International Year of Indigenous Languages to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And this process is also co-chaired by a Sami person, which is Aili Keskitalo from the Sami Parliament in Norway. She has been very active in this process, and also other Arctic indigenous peoples participate in this. And this year, that sorry, it was a mistake here. It was 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages. It was proclaimed because of the critical loss of languages around the world, including the Arctic. Some communities, language communities, are very small, so just tens of people, or even couple of individuals who can speak that language, and some are more or less endangered, but still there is a common understanding that Arctic indigenous languages are definitely under threat, and there is the International Year, and the following decade is a good chance to collect all the resources together and make a good leap toward preservation and revitalization, in some cases, of indigenous languages. So the year was very important for raising awareness about the problem, and the decade will be the time for action. Another mechanism is an individual mechanism, special rapporteur, who is currently Francisco Cali from Guatemala, and he's a Maya person. So his mandate is established to go to states, make country reports, communicate important issues of concern to states, work with the complaints from indigenous communities, collect best practices and promote them, and special rapporteurs do many other important things too. And the expert mechanism has done studies, thematic studies on education, participation in decision making, access to justice, cultural heritage, health, lands, migration. So many studies. Currently, there is a study. They do a study on self-determination and the rights of the indigenous child. And the expert mechanism has also a right to interpret the provisions of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and enlarge our understanding of the indigenous people's rights. For example, if in the Article 11 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is written about that states shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution,
It looks.
Was I lost? Yeah. So I'm concluding with my presentation. Just one more slide I think I would like to show. So I showed. I think this was the last I showed. Okay. Yeah, and another element of the country engagement of the expert mechanism mandate is country engagement. So by request of states or indigenous peoples, experts can go to countries and help to facilitate dialogue between them, or help with particular things like improvement of legislation, like it was in Finland, when Sami Parliament requested to provide guidance on how to reform the law on Sami Parliament Act. So, and experts went and helped and facilitated dialogue with the state. Another visit was in Mexico City, where experts helped to, they provided guidance how to better implement the local constitution of the Mexico City in order to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples. One interesting example is from New Zealand, when experts went by request of the Maori people and help them to create a national action plan on the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And now New Zealand is the only country in the world who has this kind of action plan with the help of experts. And the repatriation case is one of the most successful country engagements. And this Masakova, so this is a reindeer head that has a cultural value for the Yaqui people residing in Mexico and the United States, and which was possessed by the Swedish Museum of World Culture and was requested by the Yaqui people to be returned. So with the help of the expert mechanism, there was a principal agreement to return this Masakova back to the cultural societies of the Yaqui people. So these are examples of how indigenous peoples can actually influence at different levels: local level, regional, domestic, regional, international level, and how they can achieve some success in this process. So thank you very much, and I will be very happy to answer any possible questions.
Thank you so much, Alexey. And if everyone wants to join me once again in giving a virtual round of applause, that was a really comprehensive and insightful presentation. We have about 20 minutes, and our first question comes from Elena, who's a PhD student at Yale University on sociocultural anthropology. And she would like to know, does the notion of indigeneity vary from region to region? If so, how are these differences reconciled in the universal definition given by the United Nations?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting question. Actually, there is no international definition or one definition that established internationally, and this was a principal agreement, I believe, that because there was a need to take into account the many differences between state legislation and different particular situations in the regions, the variety and the diversity of indigenous peoples situations, and also state situations. So the lack of a universal definition provides for more flexibility when states craft their own legislation, but also we should admit that it provides also for some problems with recognition. And as I, for example, mentioned this specific term in the Russian legislation, indigenous small number peoples, that among other criteria has this criteria of numerically smallness, right? So it should be a community that doesn't exceed population 50,000 people, and it's highly problematic, right? Because even for those indigenous peoples that are already listed as small number, because the Nenets people, for example, they, according to the last two censuses, so they're growing, and right now, so they are something about 49,000. So they can easily exceed next year, or this year actually, we have a census, exceed this bar of 50,000 people, and should they be then excluded? I don't know. This is for me, it is a highly a questionable issue. And some countries, not Arctic countries, but some countries in the world, so they do not even recognize indigenous peoples. They create different names for them, like mountain peoples or national minorities, like in China, for example. So China doesn't really recognize indigenous peoples, and we have some problems in Indonesia and Thailand, in Asia region in general, and some in African countries, for example, they say that all peoples in Africa are indigenous peoples, and that they create different terms like traditional communities or historically undeserved peoples, and it has a lot of impact, operational impact. For example, when it comes to the policies of the World Bank, which have a lot of influence on communities on the ground, because when the World Bank implements something or funds infrastructure programs, infrastructure projects by states or business companies, so they rely on, the bank relies on their policies, and if it's written there that it's not only indigenous peoples but also those traditional communities, so states can refer to these policies and avoid consulting with indigenous peoples. So the lack of definition is an advantage, but also a problem.
Thank you. And we actually have a follow-up to that question from Susanna. If you would like to come on and ask your follow-up.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Alexey, for the presentation. Really insightful and right up my alley. But I think you've just really touched on my question. My question was looking at issues of numbers, where you're speaking in Russia, where the population count is, where I guess the word indigenous is associated with a certain number, and then looking at China, where we have, minorities, and how, I guess, the political loadedness of that term indigenous. And I didn't know if there was anything more you could, I wanted to ask more about that, but you did just speak to that. So I might just leave it at that, unless there's more that you'd like to add about using that definition in the UN when it's not universally recognized.
Yes, and thank you.
Thank you.
The special rapporteur actually, when visited Russia, touched upon this topic and suggested that Russia would apply international standards, and that those larger indigenous peoples would be approached in a similar way as small numbered peoples. So actually there is and also the expert mechanism has done some reference to the problem of small numbered indigenous peoples in Russia. Of course, there is one could accept the sentiment of the Russian legislators when they created this term, because the Russian society is so vast, is so diverse in terms of different peoples, and the legislator logic was to support the most vulnerable, those who are really at the brink of extinction. But this should not be really at the expense of other indigenous peoples. That Karelians, for example, they do have the same features, except for the number, right? So they have their own traditional occupations, the self-recognition as indigenous. They have language and culture and self-government bodies and everything as other indigenous peoples, except that they are larger. They are something like 65,000 in Russia. And also one more point: this situation of different legislation doesn't provide for the for equal approach towards the same indigenous people. For example, the Setu people that lives in Estonia and Russia, it has a status of an indigenous people in Russia, but doesn't have this kind of status in Estonia. Or the Evenki people. Evenki people lives in 3 countries, in Russia, Mongolia, and China. And 40,000 Evenki in China, 37,000 in Russia, and 1,000 in Mongolia. And the lack of recognition in China, for example, doesn't provide for a cross-border cooperation of Evenki people as one indigenous people.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask Devora if you would like to come on and ask your question.
Sure, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with everyone, and thank you, Alexey, for your presentation. It's wonderful to hear all the details, and I'm sure that if you had the rest of the afternoon, you could continue to speak with us and share your knowledge and experience. My question has to do with the use of the terminology. So it's interesting to follow up this other conversation about terminology around indigeneity or indigenous. Twice in your presentation, you mentioned sustainability, once in the context of environmental sustainability and the other time in the context of sustainable development. And my question centers on the fact that the sustainability development goals don't formally or informally even integrate climate justice and environmental justice principles or priorities. So I was wondering if you could speak about how the language, even the framing of sustainability might be changing now that we need to be considering climate justice and environmental justice as a way to actually foreground Indigenous and other voices that are usually left out and traditionally been left out deliberately from the sustainability discussion.
Yeah, thank you for this important question. Yeah, I I believe, and that was a real problem when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, and Indigenous peoples really had a very small group of advocates that were present in New York and were able to actually go to every single meeting and advocate that at least several indicators and several goals would include the reference to Indigenous peoples as one of the vulnerable groups, because states could always say that, okay, we do not need to emphasize Indigenous peoples, especially because they already are included in the term vulnerable groups. And I believe that the lack of reference to the climate justice is there because the two processes, the process of Paris agreements and the process of sustainable development goals, were kind of parallel processes, and it was somehow probably difficult to incorporate everything that was discussed in the Paris process, the climate change process, to the sustainable development goals, and also knowing how difficult were the negotiations on the Paris agreements. But I believe that Indigenous presence in the Paris agreements, in the Paris, the climate change dialogue was and has been more active than in the Sustainable Development Goals, so which could lead to more reference or better inclusion of the climate justice in the next Sustainable Development Agenda, or development agenda that would follow the Sustainable Development Goals. And discussions have already started. We also speak that Indigenous languages, for example, should be incorporated in the next Sustainable Development Agenda, the climate justice, and many other very topical issues for Indigenous peoples. So, and that's very important that the participation of those peoples is ensured.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Madison to come on to ask your question.
Thanks so much for the very interesting presentation, Alexey. So my question is, as far as I'm aware, and I could be incorrect, the Indigenous permanent participants in the Arctic Council, they're officially observers and therefore don't have any voting rights in the Council. So all the decision making is made by the remaining Arctic member states. I was just wondering if you thought that this current system is effective, or is there any improvements that could be made to the system of the Arctic Council to increase the rights and voice of the Indigenous peoples in the Arctic?
Yes. Thank you for this question. Yeah, that's right. So Indigenous peoples are, while they have the status of permanent participants, so they are still, so they do not have a power to make decisions in the council. But given the global context, actually this practice is still a best practice because in many other organizations or institutions, including the United Nations, it is difficult to imagine such a level of involvement of indigenous peoples in decision making. And as far as I know, indigenous organizations have an influence in the Arctic Council. So they really, the states would not like to make any decision in the council without ensuring that it is not problematic for indigenous peoples. So, and that's why the processes of negotiation of different treaties are quite long sometimes, and it is just because there is a need to ensure that there is a consensus. And I know, for example, right now some indigenous, because the issue of traditional knowledge is one of the sorry, one of the most important in the Arctic Council's agenda, and was enshrined in the Ottawa Declaration, which was the founding document of this body. So now indigenous peoples offer that there could be a change of name, so not traditional knowledge, but indigenous knowledge. And there is a discussion around that because some states and even some indigenous peoples are reluctant to the change because it would invoke additional guarantees or additional measures that states will need to provide for the preservation of traditional knowledge, and also preservation or ensuring the intellectual property rights of indigenous peoples.
Great, thank you. And I see that we are at the hour. So I am going to ask just one more question, or ask Hyung-sa to come on and ask his question. And then we will finish up our first hour.
Yes, thank you for very interesting presentation, Alexei. I have one question to you. How do you think about the role of translation or translator and interpretation and interpretator to understand Arctic indigenous languages? Thanks.
Excuse me, could you please repeat the last sentence?
Yes. Yes, my question is about how do you think about the role of translation or translator and interpretation or interpretator to understand Arctic indigenous languages? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is very important to give a room for the Arctic languages, and even to give the room for the Arctic languages in the decision-making processes as well, in the international organizations. And I know that, for example, the Sami Parliament in Finland, so the Samis, they speak different languages, right? So they, even in Finland, so they have 3 different Sami languages. So they have to understand each other, and this is a principal issue that they speak, those who know the language, so they speak their own language in the meetings of the Sami Parliament in Finland. So, and there is the building allows for interpretation, and so those who cannot speak, so they speak Finnish, and this is also translated, interpreted. They have interpreters booths in the building, and so the interpretation is ensured. I know that many other indigenous meetings that involve indigenous peoples, so they have interpretation opportunities, and this is probably not the case right now in the work of the Arctic Council or the Byrons Council, which is a pity, but I think we could move towards that. So the Arctic Council would also include indigenous languages, not just as a symbolic way of recognition of them, but also as a practical mean for their promotion and survival, and because we should show that these languages are not just languages are spoken in homes, but they are capable to be spoken in highly complicated political discussions or scientific discussions and so on. So this is a very, very important issue.
Great. Thank you. And because we are a bit past the hour, unfortunately, we will not have time for all of the questions in the chat, but I have copied all of them and will send them to Alexey and also post them in our Slack channel so we can have a robust discussion amongst ourselves, because I think I speak for all of us in that there were some pretty big themes, questions, ideas that were shared here. That's a great start to our 10 weeks of learning to really dig deep about how to combine things of governance and Indigenous rights and a changing climate and working across borders. And I think this is a good start to a college that will bring all of those questions in every session that we have. So with that, Alexey, thank you so much for giving us your time and your insights and expertise. It is incredibly appreciated, and I look forward to following up with you and hopefully engaging you in future Arctic colleges.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you all. It has been a pleasure, and yes, please send me the questions. I will happily answer and happily participate in your further activities. So thank you very much, and good luck with the other program.
Thank you. And thank you again. I see lots of clapping and thank yous in the chat. And with that, we are switching from one incredible speaker to our second speaker to kick off our first session here. And I'm going to invite Batsheba, who I know is on the call somewhere, and I will spotlight her to give our second talk today. And she will be talking to us about another big theme, Arctic energy before petroleum, what whales tell us about writing history. And for those of you who are not able to read her bio on our Google site, she is an assistant professor at Brown University, a pretty incredible environmental historian that I think combines storytelling and impactful analysis quite beautifully, most recently in her book, Floating Coast, which I highly recommend as weekend reading for everyone here. And today she'll be sharing what whales tell us about writing history, which is an inquisitive title that I'm sure we are all excited to hear about. So Batsheba, would you like to come on and introduce yourself?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. My power went out earlier today and I was in a little bit of a panic about whether or not I would even be able to join. So I'm very happy that the technology has come through. And it's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation, Victoria. And thank you everyone who is here. It's lovely to see you all. I have the impression that a lot of you are where I wish I was, which is to say a lot further north than Rhode Island, which is where I'm writing out the pandemic. What I want to do today is it's going to be a little bit of a change of pace from the presentation that you just heard, but I think in some ways we'll actually have some thematic resonances in the sense that it's talking about ideas of borders and how to think with and participate in the ways in which Indigenous folks in the Arctic have long-term sovereign claims and ways of understanding the space that often run counter to how it's represented by media down south, by scholars sometimes, and that this is probably something that will continue to come up, I imagine, as the Arctic College continues over this semester. And it's a little bit of an introduction to some of the themes and ideas that I think about as an environmental historian, which is roughly speaking, the ways in which human beings and the environments they live in kind of change each other over time. So not thinking about human beings alone as the actors in history, but kind of putting them in an ecological context. So I'm going to show a couple of slides. Hopefully I'm able to do that. Should come up here. Okay. All right, hopefully that's come up, yes. And I'm going to introduce you to the part of the Arctic that I know the best, which is roughly between what is now Russia and what is now Alaska, and the lands and seas of the Bering Sea, the Chukchi Sea, and the Beaufort Sea around the Bering Strait. And in particular, I'm interested in this part of the world in the ways in which different kinds of energy extraction have existed here, particularly prior to the kinds of energy extraction that get the most attention in the Arctic now, which are fossil fuels of various kinds. So thinking about the ways in which both indigenous peoples in the Arctic and foreigners or newcomers in the Arctic have looked to Arctic ecosystems for particular kinds of energy resources. And I'm also interested as a historian in the ways in which the histories that we tell or other kinds of social science work that is done in the Arctic can push back against some big narratives about the far north as being a place that's barren, which is something that often comes up in popular representations of the far north, and that it's a place that was essentially unchanging before the contemporary era of global warming. So to think about the Arctic as a fully historical place that has been host to all sorts of different cultures and has this kind of long history of changing ways in which people have related to their environments. So first of all, where are we? We're the part of the world I'm going to talk about today, which might have come up in Alexei's talk, is here around the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas. And it's a part of the world where the ecosystem is really defined by sea ice, which again is one of those things that come up in many discussions of the far north now as a source of kind of threat and concern, right? We're often given information about the ways in which sea ice patterns are changing and decreasing that are supposed to be of concern. So I'm going to talk about sea ice before we started worrying about it being too scarce and going away, and think about sea ice as it was understood and used by people and animals living in the Arctic at the end of the 19th century for the most part. And the sea ice is critical to the Bering Sea because it really kind of sets the tenor for the whole ecosystem and the way that it functions. The formation of new ice each fall and then the melting of that ice in the spring helps make the Bering and the Chukchi Seas some of the richest biological areas in the world. In terms of the numbers of different species and the capacity for the plant life, particularly the phytoplankton, to fix carbon from sunlight. And that act of photosynthesis is where the energy that we use as animals comes from, right? Even fossil fuels are just really old photosynthesis that have been concentrated over time. The ecosystems in the Bering Sea rest on phytoplankton, which are these tiny diatoms and algae, here magnified many, many, many times, which kind of form the basis of the entire ecosystem. They do that work of taking sunlight and mixing it with minerals and with the water that they swim in and turning it into carbon that other animals and other organisms can use. Some of those organisms are these big kind of clouds of small crustaceans and tiny fish that we call krill, that grow by the tens of millions, particularly in the spring and summer, right as the sea ice is starting to melt. There are huge blooms of diatoms, and then out of those blooms of diatoms and algae, you get these huge crowds of krill. The krill feed many kinds of ocean animals, seabirds, fish, crabs. They're really kind of a key piece of the food web. And they also feed one of the kind of most critical organisms for human beings in the Bering Sea, which are bowhead whales, which are up here at the corner. Bowheads primarily sieve that krill out of the Bering Sea ecosystem through the baleen in their mouths, which is this kind of long almost hair-like apparatus. It can be 9 or 10 feet tall because they're huge animals that seeds tons of this krill out of the ocean. The krill's really fatty, and the whales digest it and turn it into absolutely massive bodies. Bowhead whales can be almost 100 tons, and about 50% of a whale is fat by volume. So they're about as close to a floating stick of butter as you can find in an Arctic organism. And bowhead whales follow the schools of krill, which follow the kind of melting edge of the sea ice north each summer. So if you look at the map that's kind of at the corner of the screen here in green, the bowhead whales follow those little black arrows north, kind of around St. Lawrence Island, which is that little green speck in the Bering Sea. They go through the Bering Strait, they head over into the Beaufort Sea, and then in the fall, they kind of move across to what is now Russia, and then swim south again as the sea ice starts to form. So bowheads are really adapted to live on the edge of the ice, and particularly adapted to feed off of the krill that grows from the kind of diatoms that emerge out of this ice age, or this sea ice ecosystem. And bowhead whales are really critical species for many Arctic indigenous peoples in Canada, in Greenland, and then here around the Bering Strait in what is now Russia and Alaska, because they take organisms that are not particularly useful to people. We can't go out to sea and strain krill out of the water, but human beings can hunt and eat and use many parts of bowhead whales, and have done so now in the high Arctic and kind of the subarctic around the Bering Strait for thousands of years. And bowhead whales are actually so rich that they have sustained permanent or semi-permanent settlements along the edge of the Bering Sea, which, if you think about the ways in which we kind of tend to think about human settlement and living permanently and not nomadically in a particular place, it's usually associated with agriculture. But the migratory patterns of bowhead whales brought so much kind of caloric density close to Arctic communities that they were able to not move and build these kind of permanent or semi-permanent communities along the edge of the Bering Strait, particularly in places that intersect with the migration routes of the bowheads. There are kind of 3 major whaling societies that live around the edge of the Bering Strait by the 19th century, which is the century I'm going to talk most about today. In the United States, or what's now the United States, there were Inupiaq and Yupik, and on what's now the Russian side, there were Yupik and Chukchi. For the kind of sake of not overgeneralizing too much, although I'm already going to do that more than I would like to, I'm primarily going to talk about Inupiaq whale hunters in what is now Alaska. And the Yupik and Inupiaq communities along the Alaska coastline very much kind of understood and used whales as a critical part of forming their communities, both in a caloric sense, in the sense that these animals were critical to providing people's food, and in many cases fuel, because this is a part of the world that doesn't have a lot of trees on the ground. So being able to burn whale oil in homes helped to light and warm people through the winters. And so the kind of yearly round of whaling communities was very attuned to when the bowheads were migrating near them. In the spring, and then again in the fall, depending on the community, people would go out onto the sea ice and kind of wait for the arrival of the bowhead whales. Because the bowheads tend to make their way north through these open leads in the sea ice, like you can see in the bigger picture here, they follow cracks in the ice up north. Hunters would sit on the edge, they would stay very quiet and listen for the sound of whales rising to breathe. The whales themselves also do a lot of listening in the ice. They have to be very careful to not get stuck because they need to breathe. So they would periodically also bump up against the bottom of the sea ice, which is another thing that hunters would pay attention to, the kind of sounds of the thunk of the whale hitting the bottom of the ice. So whale hunters were very finely attuned to the kind of ways in which whales participated in using the sea ice and were incredibly knowledgeable about the patterns of these animals. And I should say that I am using the past tense as a historian because I'm talking about the 19th century, but these are very much ways in which people now, Inupiaq, Yupik, and Chukchi communities across this part of the Arctic participate in whaling. So these are present practices, not things that have ceased to be really important and vital for communities. So sitting on the edge of the sea ice and kind of waiting for whales to come was partly a kind of practical and important practical activity for whale hunting communities, but it's also deeply connected to the ways in which Inupiaq communities and Yupik communities understand their relationship to the worlds around them. So it's, you know, not just kind of portrayed in the way that I think many hunters from southern communities think about hunting as sort of a leisure activity or a sport. It's something that's considerably more rooted in the kind of deep social practice of these communities. And critical to that, if you're not somebody from a whaling community and kind of coming in from the outside, as I did, is to understand how in both the oral histories and the present practice of Inupiaq communities, the whales are understood as being sentient moral animals who understand the worlds of the human beings who hunt them and are actually capable of judging and kind of relating to that human social world. So they're not imagining human beings as completely separate or you know, just as threats, but as kind of part of this relational social world that goes back and forth between human beings and whales. And Inupiaq hunters and Yupik hunters that I've talked to in Russia have also described the ways in which whales would observe hunters at a distance from their boats, and if hunters behaved correctly and have observed the kind of right social behavior between people and whales and between people and other human beings, would choose whether or not to give themselves to particular hunters. So the understanding of bowhead whale behavior is that whales choose whether or not to die when confronted with a person who has behaved in particular ways that are morally upstanding. So as a historian, I am not able to speak to a whale or interview a bowhead whale and ask them about their relationships with this, although I do, of course, speak to people who know the whales very well. But it is possible to say, as a historian coming from the outside, that the primary experience that bowhead whales have had with human beings up until the middle of the 19th century was this kind of one in which people hunted a couple of hundred whales at the absolute maximum per year out of a population of over 20,000 bowheads. So bowheads certainly had an experience with whalers on the edge of the sea ice, but it was not kind of the dominant way in which whales were interacting. This changes very dramatically after 1848. That year, the first commercial whale ship coming from New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is right down the road from where I am now in Rhode Island, arrives in the Bering Strait. And this ship had come so far north to feed a very different kind of demand for whales than that which fed people in the Bering Strait. Cities like Boston and New York and Providence used whale oil to light their homes. They used it in lighthouses. And some kinds of whale products were used in various sorts of industrial manufacturing processes and to treat wood or treat wool and other kinds of textile processes in the kind of early industrial United States. And because the population of people in these cities was growing, and because whale oil was considered the best kind of lighting that you could have prior to the use of refined petroleum products, the demand for whale oil kept going up. So these whale ships would leave out of New Bedford or Providence or Nantucket or kind of the other whaling towns along the eastern seaboard. And they had more or less killed their way through the whale species they could hunt easily in the Atlantic. So they start moving south in the Atlantic. Eventually they round South America and start coming north up all the way through the Pacific to Hawaii. And by the 1840s, they're starting to so decimate the whale populations around Hawaii that they're moving further north. This particular captain, whose name is Thomas Royes, had heard a rumor that from some Russian naval officers that there were large populations of whales very far north, and so he risks it in 1848. And it turns out that he's very glad that he kind of risks going up to the Bering Strait because he finds whales everywhere. And his descriptions of this is really, he kind of goes into his lavish description when he comes back to Hawaii about the ways in which bowhead whales not only yield enormous numbers of barrels of oil, but also they seem to be so kind of docile that they look like they're just offering themselves up to hunters. So it's not very difficult for these commercial whalers to kill as many whales as they want to when they first arrive in the Bering Strait. And because the whalers are driven by the need to get more whale oil, that's kind of their primary motivation. They're not paid until they come back to their home port and sell the oil that they've managed to harvest over the preceding, sometimes several years that they have been at sea. The next year after Thomas Roy's reports of whale oil hit the press in Hawaii, more than 100 ships sail north out of the Hawaiian Islands to the Bering Strait to start killing. And for a couple of years, these commercial whalers who are, killing whales not for their meat, they didn't really eat much of the whale meat that they killed. For the most part, they just let the carcass, other than the fat, which they stripped off and refined into whale oil, sink to the bottom. They'd also collect the baleen because it was useful for applications that we now use spring steel or plastic for, so umbrella handles and various other kinds of things, particularly corset stays. The fashion at the time meant that women were supposed to have these very small waists that were kind of disciplined into shape by wearing whalebone corsets. They would take the fat, they would take the baleen, and they would let the rest of the carcass just fall to the ocean floor, which is a very different way, of course, of relating to a whale than the kind of full use of the carcass that Inupiaq communities and Yupik communities had been doing for a long time. And so the number of whales that whalers need to kill, these commercial whalers, was extraordinarily large, basically as many as they could possibly kill so that they could get paid when they returned to their ports. And because they were not using as much of the whale, the kind of carnage that these whale ships left behind was quite large. And you can get a sense from the, excuse me, my slides are sticking. The ways in which whalers thought about whales kind of appear in their diaries, the logbooks that they would keep on the ships, which are filled with these stamps, like you see at the top of the screen there. That hollow box in the middle of the whale would be filled in with the number of barrels of oil that the whale produced. So generally speaking, the whales were kind of reduced to just this small number of whale oil barrels. And that was the way that people thought of them, right? They were not members of society. They were not animals capable of judgment. They were just kind of things to be turned into commodities. And they wrote in their diaries about whale behavior, which is, for a historian, a particularly interesting kind of part of the historical record. In 1848, the whalers talk about the whales being extremely easy to kill. They do this again in 1849, they do it in 1850, and they do it in 1851. But in 1852, so just 4 years after the first capitalist whale ship arrives in the Bering Strait, something changes in the way that these commercial whalers talk about the animals that they're trying to kill. Instead of the scenes like you see kind of in the paintings here, where there are just sort of whales everywhere, there are spouts all the way to the horizon, and the whalers are able to approach them extremely easily, suddenly the whales are disappearing into the sea ice as soon as they see the wooden ships approaching. And these ships, of course, are very different from the ways in which Inupiaq and Yupik whalers are approaching bowheads by small open boats. The whalers use these kind of Moby Dick style tall wooden ships, then with smaller whale boats that would go out and actually do the harpooning. And many of the whalers describe how as soon as the whales heard the kind of sound of that wooden boat hitting the water, they would start moving toward the sea ice. And the ways in which the whalers understood this is that the bowheads had learned that the sea ice was actually too dangerous for these wooden ships to approach, which makes some sense. If you are, the captain of a wooden whaling ship in the 19th century, you don't want to get it terribly close to the edge of the sea ice because it's dangerous. The sea ice can, change because of wind direction or tides relatively quickly. If you're becalmed next to the sea ice and it moves, it can wreck one of these ships quite fast. So the whale ships are not able to come up close to the edge of the sea ice, and the bowheads have learned this and have started using the ice as a form of protection. And you can see from this quote that's on the edge here, the whaling captains are very aware of this. They're keeping track of it in their logging books. And in 1852, the entire Yankee whaling fleet only manages to kill about 150 bowheads. And the kind of ability to hunt becomes so poor that the whole commercial fleet leaves the Bering Strait in 1854 and stays away for a number of years. They're not interested in attempting to get close to the sea ice. So one way to think about this particular history is that in the face of this encroaching capitalist demand and the ways in which these commercial whaling ships were putting an unprecedented burden on whale populations and hunting them at levels that whales had never experienced before, the whales start using sea ice in a really different way. Instead of, they'd always spent time around the edges of it, but they start using it very deliberately as a shelter from this particular kind of hunting. And while they were still willingly dying for indigenous hunters around the Bering Strait, they were trying their very best to avoid dying for commercial or for market hunters coming from the East Coast. Eventually, and unfortunately for the history of the bowhead whales and for the history of indigenous folks around the Bering Strait, human adaptations on the part of these capitalist whalers would eventually get to the point where they could approach the sea ice more easily. And by the end of the 19th century, they have pushed bowhead populations very close to extinction. But if you pay attention to this kind of several year period in the 1850s, the kind of orientation by which historians and social scientists trained the way that I was trained, which is to think about humans as sort of the primary drivers of history, starts to look a little bit different. And in particular, it is kind of a call, I think, to look at the historical record and think of it not necessarily just as one of human innovations becoming better at chasing bowhead whales for the good of the market, but instead to take seriously the knowledge of Inupiaq hunters, the interpretation of bowhead actions that Inupiaq hunters have understood and have used to relate to whales for a very long time, to ways in which biologists and people working in marine mammal behavior have started to think about bowhead whales as animals with culture and incredibly sophisticated communicative abilities. And to look at this as a moment in which bowhead whales were making real choices and had emotional responses, and perhaps even moral or ethical responses to the ways in which these new hunters coming from the East Coast of the United States were choosing to hunt them. That is, the bowhead whales were making a judgment that this particular kind of mass killing was one that they were not willing to participate in, and were trying in every way that they could as a whale to reject through their behavior. So one way of thinking about this is that the Arctic is a place of abundance. If you come to the Arctic or have learned about the Arctic as Inupiaq people do, as many indigenous folks in the Arctic do, as one in which you have a reciprocal relationship with the animals and the ecosystems that you depend upon, and not as a site simply of extraction. The Arctic for commercial whalers ends up looking like a place of barrenness because it is made barren by excessive hunting, not because it initially begins that way. Secondly, the sea ice, which is often kind of associated, and certainly was associated in the minds of the whalers as a source of danger, as a place that sort of resists all kinds of life that people from the South import visions of to the Arctic. It doesn't have agriculture. It seems kind of empty, is in fact an incredibly rich and generative space, both for the kind of biological communities that emerge around the edges of the sea ice, from the plankton all the way up through the bowhead whales to the human beings that have so long subsisted and had these, kind of complex social relationships with the whales that they live with. And more generally, as a historian, I think that this kind of particular moment in the 1850s, where you see the actions of whales changing so dramatically in the face of a particular and new kind of threat, and a threat that's driven by an ideology that is very foreign to and kind of imported to the Arctic, and an ideology that's really focused on extracting energy from it without any kind of reciprocity or relationship that's ongoing with the particular place, is to kind of think about it as an opportunity to imagine histories as ones in which whales do in fact live in their own underwater societies, that they are communicating through their behaviors what kinds of relationships they wish to see with human beings, and to take very seriously the kind of intellectual traditions of Indigenous peoples who have understood these histories in very different terms than Western historians, and to take very seriously the intellectual capabilities of the whales themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. If everyone could join me in giving a virtual round of applause for I think, really overarching and well-connected presentation from our first one, thinking about how this particular moment we are living in is not unique, right? It is part of a continuum through which we can look and learn from the many histories of the Arctic, all the way up to our final session, which will look to the futures of the Arctic. We have just over 20 minutes for a robust discussion with our speaker, and I am going to ask Victoria to come on to kick off that discussion.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I found it really, really interesting, and I always like hearing about home, so it was really nice. My name is Victoria Kutuk-Bushman, and I'm from a town in northern Alaska called Ugric, and we're the largest bowhead whaling community in the world. So I was raised with sort of that perspective around sort of sustainability and the use of natural resources and sort of connections with nature and things like that. I'm a conservation biologist now, and I apologize, it's getting dark. It's 3:30 in the afternoon, so the sun is going down. But yeah, I just wanted to, so many of the things that you were saying really resonated with me, just because like we have been a peoples who have been allowed to really practice our culture pretty consistently. In some ways, colonialism has been very difficult for us. But one thing that we have really been able to hold on to is the fact that a lot of our hunting and fishing methods look exactly like they did 150 years ago. We still do a lot of things traditionally by sealskin boats, hunt by hand. We use modern explosives now when we hunt bowhead, just because it's a little bit more ethical. You can get a direct kill, and so everybody prefers it that way. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that presentation, and then of course to promote that there are many Indigenous communities across the North that are still engaging in the world in very traditional ways. I actually live now in Greenland, and it's exactly the same here. Inuit still hunt by kayak and by spear for different species. But yes, thank you for your presentation. It was really nice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you for reiterating. I always worry because as a historian, my just way of speaking is to fall into the past tense. And so many of these things that I was talking about today are not in the past. The whaling by tall ships like Moby Dick, that is in the past, but the indigenous whaling practices are not. And it's really very important to reiterate the ways that they continue and how important they are. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe speaking about language and what language we use, could I ask Nicholas to come on and ask your question?
Sure. I hope my microphone is working. Is it? Yep. Okay. Hi, Dr. Demuth. It's good to see you. Thank you very much for that presentation. So as a historian, I guess I was wondering, we're in this period of time in kind of scientific thinking where we're bandying around a whole lot of these terms that really want to distinguish the current moment from past kind of epochs and eras in human history. So Anthropocene's the big one, but talk about the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, and my favorite is the Cthulhucene. So I was kind of wondering, is that an ahistorical kind of attempt to catalyze action in some way? Is there a problem with that as kind of this totalizing global notion of like something has changed on a global level, whereas what your research all points out to is that regions have their very distinct histories and that they go through them at different times. And so is the local kind of being erased in some way in those? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually teach a class on the Anthropocene, which it feels like every year it becomes more of a referendum on whether or not the term is even worth using, which maybe means I should retitle the course. So I think that there's a couple of things that as a historian are tricky about using a term like the Anthropocene. One of which, and probably the one that's the most commented on, is the way in which that term tends to generalize human experience to this very broad species level kind of set of circumstances, when it doesn't take, it takes just a very cursory knowledge of the present to realize that people live in really different ways, and therefore the ways in which they live have a very different impact on the world. If you think about who's using fossil fuels, right? We do not all use the same amount of fossil fuel in our daily lives. And historically, that has also been true. So one of the big critiques of the Anthropocene is that it sort of flattens all people into this kind of homo economicus who goes around, burning lots of fuel and changing things, as opposed to paying attention to the ways in which those are political decisions often and cultural decisions. And therefore, there is actually alternatives both in the past and in the present to some of the kind of economic forms that get us into this sort of bind. So I would say as a historian, it's not a term that I choose to use. I think, however, where I do find it to be interesting and helpful is that it is kind of from its origins very interdisciplinary and tends to pull together people with a bunch of different backgrounds, right? So you can invoke the term Anthropocene and have folks who are trained in earth sciences having a discussion with people who are trained in ecology and thinking about mass extinction, having a discussion with people in English departments who are thinking about eco-poetics. So kind of as a heuristic device that gets a bunch of minds in a room who are interested in thinking about the human relationship with the world that we live in, it can be extremely useful. So I guess that's the difference between kind of a term to collect people under versus an explanatory one, where I think as a historian, I'm always leery of things that paint human experience as universal, I guess.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think that, it speaks to our current cohort and how many different disciplines and knowledges and practitioners we have brought together, and finding common ways of having discussions and building bridges between those. I'm going to ask Corinne to come on and ask your question.
Sure. I hope you can hear me. I put in the chat box that I was just wondering, I really appreciated this presentation. We're currently in the Inuvialuit settlement region. Oh, look, I'm on screen now. I am sitting with Jason Lau. We're both in Nunavut Northwest Territories. And this is speaking to the beluga population that frequents the Beaufort Sea region that we're within. In our region, they come here for food, basically for food, and they migrate here to have their young. But I guess I'm just wondering, when conducting your research, do you have a particular method in how you engage and consult with Indigenous intellectual property holders? And I'm coming from a standpoint, a lot of conversations that are happening in our region is giving proper credit to traditional knowledge holders. I just wanted to hear your yeah, your insights.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, and I think I mean I hope it's one that's on the minds of people working in the Arctic in general. It seems really of the essence for folks doing work up north, if you're not from the north. For this first book, Floating Coast, thought about this from kind of the very beginning of the work. I had lived in the Arctic for a long time, and so I knew that the questions that I was interested in, which in the whole book have to do with the ways in which socialist development in the Soviet Union and capitalist development in the United States kind of impact the ecologies and societies around the Bering Strait. So I was interested in these kind of big ideologies that come in from the outside as colonial forms and what they do to the environments when they try to kind of inhabit them. And I mean environment both kind of socially and ecologically. But it's also a history that's in this particular case, at a really big scale, right? There are dozens of communities on the Russian side of the Bering Strait, and then there's dozens on the American side, all of which are of course different from each other and have particular histories. And if I had 45 years to write the book, I would spend years in each of those communities. And I sincerely wish that's the way academic work operated, and it is also not. So I knew from the very beginning that if I was working at the kind of scale that this history was asking me in order to kind of think comparatively about modern socialism as the Soviet Union interpreted it and capitalism as the United States interpreted it, I was not going to be able to do that kind of ethnographic work. But I also did not want to write out the ways in which Indigenous people on both sides of the strait are fundamental to this story and cannot be excluded from it. So I talked to people I know there, and what I ended up doing was using and citing and therefore crediting very openly the published work that comes out of communities both in Russia and the United States. So Victoria probably knows work by folks like Charlie Brower who talk about whaling, but there are many works that Indigenous communities have decided are acceptable for kind of public consumption, and therefore I would use those. Credit the thinkers because they were, the source of both kind of the facts and the ideas, as opposed to doing some sort of drop-in ethnography. Didn't mean that I wasn't talking to people, of course, but I kind of chose to rely on the versions of community histories that communities had decided were public-facing, and sometimes would choose to use those over archival sources if I felt like the archival sources had not been collected very responsibly. Sometimes I work with the papers of ethnographers from the 1920s or the 1930s, and I would have real doubts, or I would know something about their relationship with the communities that made me leery about that kind, the ways in which that information had come to be did not seem responsible. And so I would not use those sources and would instead choose to work with sources that communities had kind of put their voice behind. I think it looks really different, however, if you're doing work that does not involve comparing one entire, vast nation like the Soviet Union with another entire vast nation like the United States, so that the scale at which you do research will really change kind of where you situate yourself within a community and the kinds of information that they want to share and add to that process.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to now ask Jennifer if you would like to come on and ask your question.
Hi. I am a, well, I should start by saying, so I did my dissertation research in marine mammal toxicology focused on a non-Arctic species. So I'm coming from this, from a biological standpoint. But I'm also a native Rhode Islander, so I grew up being exposed to the whaling history of the area. So I have an interest in that as well. But I found it really interesting, your talk as a whole. But from a behavioral standpoint, I was really curious if you have any information on how behavior of the whales may have or may not have changed since they've become protected from commercial harvesting. From my small knowledge of bowheads in particular, I know that they are very long-lived. So I think what the current estimate is over 100 years old or so. So from a standpoint of looking at marine mammal protections, we're still pretty early on, so I don't know that you would see any intergenerational cultural changes in behavior, but I was just curious if you had any new information on how that shift might have contributed to changes thanks to policies.
Yeah, that's a great question. And because I am a historian, my knowledge stops really in the 1970s or so, from looking at Soviet whaling, some of which included bowhead whaling illegally in the Sea of Okhotsk off Kamchatka. But the contemporary bowhead situation is not one that I'm as well versed in. It is fascinating to me because they are so long-lived. One of the whales that I opened one of the chapters with was born probably when Thomas Jefferson was president and was killed when William Jefferson Clinton was president. So, they have lifespans that look like, they're twice the lifespan of the Soviet Union, right? So I sincerely wish I could interview one. But since I can't, I don't know, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I'm particularly intrigued because the behavior of gray whales, I only know this because I was recently talking to a marine biologist who works with gray whales, has changed really dramatically since the cessation of gray whale hunting. And that the kind of gray whale behavior you see in Baja, where the female whales bring their calves up to meet whale watching boats, is really a thing that's emerged in the last 20 years or so. And prior to that, they were, not just skeptical of human presence, but would actively try to drive people out of the bays. So it's a good question, and hopefully someone takes it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I will copy that question and save it for a few weeks from now when we have our marine ecosystem shifts talks. And I think one of our speakers, Austin, might be able to at least provide a few more sentences on your question, as he's a current marine advocate. So stay tuned for that answer. But maybe sticking with this theme, I'll ask Sasha to come on and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering about if you have any knowledge of documentation on any attempted conversations between whalers and Indigenous peoples, and if any of those conversations were productive. Were there whalers that attempted to learn Indigenous languages, and how did those conversations go?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is that there was lots of communication at highly variable levels of transparency, I would say. Some whalers, particularly later in the 19th century, actually would overwinter in the Bering Strait in order to be able to catch the spring migration. And that meant they often had long-term relationships with some of the indigenous communities, whalers shipwrecked relatively often and ended up living with Yupik communities in Russia who would take them in for the winter and would be completely dependent on them because they didn't have the capacity to survive on their own. There are whalers who married into communities all up and down both coasts. So of course, learned Inupiaq or learned Yupik and had, and continue to have kind of these long-term relationships and generations of people. So there's a real spectrum of relationships and a real spectrum of kinds of understanding on the part of these commercial whalers of the indigenous folks that they were meeting and sometimes working with. Sometimes they would hire indigenous whalers onto commercial whaling crews for a season. And they really run the spectrum of that you would kind of expect in the late 19th century, from the sort of racialized understandings of Native peoples that are imported from the East Coast of the United States, to understandings that are actually much more kind of granular and sympathetic, and particularly on the part of people who learned Inupiaq or spent winters, really living with and talking with folks, could be really very sympathetic. And whalers were very aware by the end of the 19th century that their whaling behavior was causing real suffering along the Bering Strait, because as the number of bowheads go down, the ability for whaling communities that are dependent on them to successfully hunt bowheads also goes down. So there's this sort of rolling series of famine, particularly in the 1880s. And the commercial whalers actually start writing letters to the American government, sort of asking that there be some sort of aid sent north, that the government pays some attention. They don't stop whaling for the most part. They're kind of aware that, if they stop, somebody else will continue. But they do kind of understand themselves to have a real kind of moral impact in a way that in some of their letters, you can really see them struggle with. I think in a way that's analogous to conversations I had with friends now, where we're kind of aware of the environmental impact of the way that we exist and are also not simultaneously necessarily able to disentangle ourselves from, the economy that we depend on to provide us with our jobs.
Great, thank you. And I see we are at 5 minutes to the end of our session. So I'm going to ask one final question from Michael, who wants to know, can you speak more about whales as agents of culture, perhaps more about whale willingness to be harvested?
Yes, I was wondering where this question was because I am always asked. So I use the word culture partly because in the kind of the Inupiaq and Yupik histories of whales as animals that have societies or have a country of their own is kind of the understanding that folks come to whales with, right? And it's an understanding that marine biology has also started to kind of sidle up to, although using a slightly different set of terms. There's a biologist at Dalhousie University called Hal Whitehead, who talks about whales having culture and means it in kind of a very specific way. He defines it as a biologist would, but as something where, the kind of communicative abilities and the fact that whales are long-lived social animals means that they're transmitting information between them, not through genetic material, but through kind of other kinds of learning that can be shared, the way that people do or the way that other animals we know about do. And I sort of used both of those as a kind of base of permission to interpret information that's in the historical record, and to look at the ways in which different whaling communities, both indigenous and commercial, spoke about the behavior of whales changing in a really dramatic and really marked way. And, to me, that's kind of the exciting part of being able to bring in insights that don't come from the sort of way in which many historians are trained. What I don't have, like I often don't have as a historian, is the ability to assign motive to any given being in the past. And this is often true of human beings, right? I can describe that somebody did something because it exists in the record, and I don't always know why. And I feel I'm a bit in that situation in the case of the whales. And I leaned in this talk, and I lean in my work on interpreting that and kind of looking for the motives from the folks who know whales the best, which is to say the people who've been living with them for thousands of years, the indigenous communities around the Bering Strait, who interpret those behaviors as kind of a willingness to be hunted under some circumstances, and very particular circumstances, not kind of in a brazen way, right? In one that would not necessarily be interested in being hunted for the market. And, you know, that's an interpretation that some people are not going to agree with. And it's one that I'm making in part because I think that it really deserves thinking with, particularly for people who didn't grow up thinking that way about their relationships with animals and with ecosystems more generally.
Great, thank you. And I think that is a pretty nice place to wrap up our conversation. Unless you want to give a kind of final concluding note before I finish us out.
No, just thank you all for spending an hour this afternoon. I got to see, you know, a few names I know, and I'm glad to meet you in the way that we're meeting everyone in this this strange Zoom world we're in.
A strange Zoom world indeed, but also a pretty wonderful one that we can bring everyone together across so many time zones, so many countries in a way that I think is pretty unique. So thank you, Batsheva, so much for joining us for the last hour, for sharing your research, your insights, your ideas, which I know we will be continuing the conversation long after we get off Zoom today. I have copied all of our questions, so if there are any unanswered ones from the chat, I will make sure to send them to you, though I think we have successfully got through them this afternoon. So for everyone on this call, again, welcome to our first session of the Arctic Winter College. Next week, Tuesday at the same time, same place, we will be coming back together to learn about public health and community well-being with 2 more speakers. I'll be sending out an email to everyone later tonight with the recording from these 2 speakers with some contact information, some additional ideas of where we can continue this discussion, and importantly, a poll for how we can meet each one of us on this call, where we can talk to each other rather than seeing each person's face in a little screen, which I know everyone is very eager to do. So until next week, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful winter week. I will talk to you soon. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or to send them over Slack. Until then, bye everyone. See some thumbs up, lots of byes, lots of waving.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.